Six and welcome to Tuesday's Reading for Pleasure. We're going to continue today with where we left off yesterday, where Margaret had just felt a shudder and she knew that something was wrong. She thought it might just be a routine thing and she wondered what else it could be. So I'm going to find out exactly what happened and how Margaret deals with it. Okay, off we go. Monday the 15th of April 1912. My hands are shaking. I feel hot tears struggling against my eyes, and I have no idea where to begin. I feel a driving need to tell everything properly, exactly as it happened, but my mind is cluttered with confusion and exhaustion and despair. And grief. I am overcome by grief. The boat deck. I will go back to the boat deck and follow the evening through from there. Oh, no, the story begins earlier, so that is where I will start. It was after midnight and I could still hear people moving about in the passageway. Before I had time to go out and join them, there was a sharp knock on my door. I opened it to see Robert. He was smiling, but his eyes looked urgent. "Good evening, Miss Brady," he said. "You need to put on something warm and report to the boat deck with your life belt." Miss Brady? When I heard that, I felt alarmed for the first time, but I was also startled. Had I done something to offend him? That would be terrible. I must have looked upset because he reached out to pat my arm. "A routine drill," he said. "No need to fret." I knew he needed to get on with his duties, so I found a smile for him and nodded. If he said it was routine, it must be routine. Robert started for the next stateroom, but then stopped. "You'll not want to take your time, Margaret," he said. It did not seem possible, but maybe this was not a drill. "Robert," I started. "Please," he said, "there's no time to waste." He looked so worried that I did not want to trouble him with any questions, so I just nodded. "I have already woken Mrs. Carstairs, but you will want to urge her along," he said. I nodded again, and he patted my arm once more before moving on to the next stateroom. My hands trembled as I swiftly pulled on my warmest clothes. My button boots, the thickest petticoat, the grey skirt, a white blouse, and my old brown sweater. Over all this I wore Father's black wool coat, tucking gloves into one pocket and this diary into the other. On further reflection, I slipped his copy of Hamlet in as well and checked to make sure Mummy's locket was safely around my neck. Then I pulled my life belt over my head and fastened it securely. The belt was so bulky that it was hard to walk or even move my arms. Across the hall, Mrs. Carstairs was vexed at the prospect of going outside. "Why on earth are you so bundled up?" she asked me. "They are merely taking precautions, girl." If Robert wanted us to hurry, I trusted that he had a good reason. "I believe you should approach this situation as though it were serious," I said calmly. "We must do as we have been instructed." "Well, I hope they'll lock the staterooms," Mrs. Carstairs grumbled. "I have far too many valuables to risk." We had a short argument when Mrs. Carstairs decided that she did not want to expose Florence to the cold night air and that she should remain resting safely in the cabin. I would not hear of that and plucked Florence into her sweater at once. Mrs. Carstairs found this cheeky. At that moment, I found her downright stupid. Mrs. Carstairs also complained about putting on her life belt because it seemed too cumbersome. I was losing patience by now, but fortunately Robert came in just then and took over, giving quite firm instructions. "Will my valuables be safe?" Mrs. Carstairs asked. "Ought we not to go to the purser?" He told her not to worry because he would be certain to secure the cabins and that she must now go to the boat deck without further delay. As we were leaving, I looked at him, still smiling, but looking very pale in his white uniform jacket. "Everything will be fine, Margaret," he said. "The crew is very well trained." Surely that must be so, but why was he avoiding my eyes? "Shall we wait for you?" I asked. He shook his head. "Then you will join us up there?" I asked. "Straight away," he said. Still, I felt hesitant. "Ought I to stay down here and help you? I could—" He shook his head more firmly and Mrs. Carstairs sighed. "All right, come along, Margie," she said. "The sooner we go up, the sooner we can come back down." Robert was nodding, so I bent to attach Florence's lead before taking her upstairs. "Just one more thing," Robert said, and then he reached out and checked to make sure that I had fastened my life belt properly. Then he pointed me in the direction of the grand staircase and lifts and hurried off down the hall as the bell rang in one of the other cabins. "Oh, this is utterly ridiculous," Mrs. Carstairs sniffed, as we started up the grand staircase accompanied by a stream of passengers in various states of dress. We should have never been roused from our beds like this. Has this ever happened to you before? I asked. You and Mr. Carstairs have taken so many trips. In the middle of the night? She said. Certainly not. I found it outrageous, frankly. The steps seemed somehow crooked, and I could not figure out why. Was something on the ship broken? How could any of this possibly be routine? My heart began to pound, and I was finding it a little difficult to swallow. On the whole, the other passengers seemed to think this was either a jolly game or an irritating inconvenience. There was no running or pushing or even any raised voices. Mostly people were just joking or grumbling. I relaxed a little, deciding that there must be no good reason to be afraid. When we stepped outside, the sudden exposure to the icy air made me suck in a short breath. Then again, how could anyone think that the ship would hold a routine drill when it was this cold? Such an event would be sheer madness. There must be something terribly wrong. I wonder how soon they'll let us go back downstairs, Mrs. Carstairs grumbled again. This is absurd. The White Star Line will certainly be hearing from me, someone else was saying behind us. The ship's officers and seamen were uncovering the lifeboats and hurling the canvassers aside. The passengers were standing in small groups, watching with interest and chatting amongst themselves. A number of people had merely tossed coats on over their nightclothes and wore slippers on their feet. Since they all seemed to expect to go back inside momentarily, I assumed that my nerves must only be a result of my inexperience. But if that was so, why did the deck seem to tilt forward? Surely it ought not to do that. But then again, the Titanic was the finest and safest ship ever built, so there must be a reasonable explanation. The officers were calling for people to board the lifeboats, but almost no one volunteered. The Titanic was so warm and safe, with its bright lights and the dark ocean looked lonely and dangerous. For the time being, it seemed the better part of wisdom to stay aboard. I saw Captain Smith pass by with ship designer Andrews, and they were both so carefully expressionless that once again I felt a stirring of fear. If there was no problem, they would have been making reassuring remarks, and their faces would lack that tightness. Mrs. Carstairs interpreted their calm manner to suggest that everything was perfectly fine, and most of the people around us agreed with her. I wish that Robert would come out here soon. It was so dark and crowded that I was going to have to keep a very sharp eye out for him. There did not seem to be any cabin stewards on deck at that time, so they must still have had things to do below decks. In the meantime, the officers at the lifeboats were trying very hard to convince people to get aboard. A brave few did so, which encouraged others to follow along. The first boat appeared to be barely half full. I was sure that there were plenty of boats, so this did not concern me. We would all have our chance. A tremendous amount of steam was bursting noisily out of the funnels above us, and I felt a surge of hope, even though it made my ears hurt. Maybe they were getting ready to start the engines again. Someone was saying that a great crush of ice had fallen upon the decks, and that some of the third-class passengers had come up to play an impromptu game of football with the chunks. A few first-class passengers wandered down in that direction to watch and maybe collect some ice for themselves. Mrs. Carstairs, who was among the impractically dressed group, shivered next to me. I cannot be bothered with this tomfoolery, she said. I'm going inside to get warm. Faint music was coming from the first-class lounge where the band must have been playing. Tentatively, I started to follow her. No, you stay out here, MJ, she said, so you can come and report on the progress. So I stayed outdoors. I was on the port side, and the officers were repeatedly requesting that women and children only step forward. The first boat on our side was slowly filling up, and the second was being lowered to the next deck, so it would be easier to board that way. A group of women and children were ushered downstairs to meet it. No sooner had they gone than they returned, because the promenade deck windows had blocked their way, so the boat behind it began to be loaded instead. The passengers were still very quiet, waiting cooperatively to be told where to go and what to do. The only shouts came from the men manning the lifeboats, who yelled things like, "Lower away!" and "We need an able-bodied seaman over here," and the ever-present "Women and children first." The forward tilt of the deck was, to my eyes, growing more and more pronounced. I could think of no explanation unless that we couldn't actually be sinking, could we? Suddenly there was a blinding white light and a strange whistling sound, followed by the boom of an explosion up in the sky. The noise made everyone duck, and now I saw fear in formerly confident faces. My heart was pounding harder than ever, and my stomach began to ache. Distress rockets, someone murmured. Distress rockets? Impossible as it seemed, that could only mean one thing. Immediately I went inside to tell Mrs. Carstairs and tried to convince her to come back out. I was having little success, but then Mr. Hollins came over and echoed my concerns, and she peevishly returned to the boat deck. I took hold of Florence's lead and went after them. Is there really a problem here? She asked Mr. Hollins. He glanced around and then nodded slowly, as though making sure no one else was listening. The word came down from Mr. Ismay himself, I heard. You must find yourself a seat at once. Ismay was the managing director of the White Star Line, who I had been told was travelling on this voyage. He would be one of the people most likely to know the extent of this problem. Now Mrs. Carstairs' eyes widened, and she allowed Mr. Hollins to guide her over to boat number 8. And we're going to leave it there for today. So it looks like Mrs. Carstairs and Margaret are going to get in a lifeboat. So fingers crossed, but I wonder what's going to happen to Robert. Okay, so tune back in tomorrow to find out more.